Thank you, Kanagalakshmi, and thank you, Karthikeyan, and thank you, AKC, for this most precious and valuable opportunity. Um, I'm a bit dumbfounded after listening to Bal Murali because things that I'm going to say might look like I'm simply rehashed his words. So, um, and I'm also very happy to note that there are so many people that I respect are actually listening to this and be part of this. I also noticed that my PhD supervisor, David Moss, is here very silently. So it's all very unnerving. um, anyway, I think I particularly, like Balmuli said, I particularly like the way this particular series is framed. It's not just about Cisco Caste. I mean, it is not, it is important and it is about Cisco Caste scandal, but it is actually taking that opportunity as a kind of a strategic work to work long-term that might go beyond Cisco, this caste scandal, but also irrelevant of the outcome of what's happening. I mean, we all hope that it will be, we all hope for a very positive outcome. So in that sense, I think that what I'm going to say in the next 10, 15 minutes, pretty much actually all about everyday practices. And why, I'd like to start by saying, so excuse me. I would like to start by emphasizing why practices are important in this particular context, especially for people who live outside what I call the core caste affected societies, but live as diaspora in the UK, in US, and elsewhere. Because what we don't experience outside this core caste affected societies is not necessarily this violent manifestation of caste atrocities. We may not necessarily experience, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It does, it does happen in some places. I'm aware of honor killing in Europe amongst certain caste groups amongst Sri Lankan Tamil families. So it can happen, but largely speaking, what we're witnessing is sort of a very benign, at the same time, more powerful way of explaining, more powerful way of communicating with each other about each other's caste, location, and identity. So this calls for a much more nuanced approach to understand the existence and presence of caste, especially, I mean, it is happening in India as well, but I think for in this particular context, it's much more nuanced, especially in the UK or in the US. I mean, I can only start by giving a very simple anecdote from my field work, which resonates why practice is very important. And so I was speaking to this a particular, who later became my friend, interlocutor, a Dalit man, and who was extremely articulate, and he was very liked by everyone. And he was the only person who acted as a bridge to the dominant caste Maravar community. And so he was a sort of an important man from the Dalit community. So everyone sort of looked up to him. However, in private, he's always very stressed out about his role. And in fact, he explained his anxiety and stress in a very eloquent manner in Tamil, which I'll try to translate in English. He said, talking to them is like shaking hands with an egg in the armpit. So that's very fragile, and being extremely conscious of it. So whatever it may appear to be, on the surface, it may appear to be normal, but he was constantly aware of the acuteness of his fragility, of the power struggle between him and the dominant caste groups. The reason I say this, because he said then, Sadiputti, caste mind, will never die. Now, I'd like to actually draw that Sadiputti caste mind, because that's actually, caste mind, Sadiputti caste speech, and caste practice, and Tasadi Adayalam, caste symbolism. These are the markers that I find are extremely nuanced in India as well, but more recently and more powerfully, they are articulated in the West. And that is how it can escape a white person's or African American's eye, and they may not be able to notice unless the person is extremely familiar with the discrimination and how it works. So this is why I think I'm simply reiterating what Murali said, that we need the practice-oriented nuances now, especially for those who live in outside here in places like the US or UK, because the practice approach is also, once you tune that, it's a more non-essentialist tradition. It's a non-essentialist route to unpack, and much more suited to present realities of caste than our existing influential social, structural, ideological, and cultural identity approaches. I will talk about the relationship between caste and our cultural identity in a minute. For example, caste mind, Sadiputti, and especially in the US or the UK and in good parts of Europe that I'm familiar with, caste mind can also operate as culture. It can also operate as culture. It can remain a source of a social practice, can also remain a source of caste mind without having to actively degrade others. It can simply be out there as a salient, omnipresent. It's omnipresent. It's just waiting for a moment to be ruptured. When it gets ruptured, then it may take different forms and manifestation. Until then, it's dormant. And that dormant is actually, it's pretty much, it's sustained by practices. In other words, if caste is a virus, the virus needs to be killed, whether it's actually dormant or active. In fact, when it's dormant, it's much more dangerous because we know it exists. So the idea is to annihilate caste. A virus needs to be annihilated. Therefore, the practice is what actually keeps the caste alive, the virus alive. So what we actually say practices are necessarily, in my view, practices are source of expression of casteism. Practices do not produce casteism. Practices are itself is a source of casteism. For example, if that I've come across this example quite often especially among dominant caste progressives. Now, love marriage between two otherwise progressive two progressive people belonging to same caste group, but then often citing growing reasons for that love marriage between those two same people belong to the same caste group. Reasons for that, they will normally cite growing up in the same environment, natural affinity for similar cultural practices such as food habits. But one may be tempted to see these practices as privatized and domesticated practice, but they are, as again Murali said, they are often sites of reproducing rituals, social networks, and inequalities. And so, so therefore caste can never be private in that sense. The second point I'd like to when we talk about practices, I'd like to draw your attention to pay more careful attention to the term articulation as caste practice. And here, when I say articulation, it's not just about utterances of words. Articulation is often, I argue, beyond text, speech, and language. It is loaded with inferences, meanings, and political and economic positions. Articulation as a caste practice also signals what connections and meanings ought to be made from a simple fact. Now we know this outing set the whole context. Now the outing is if we look at the way how the outing was done, it might have done as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, it might have happened. John Doe, do you know that he actually came, he's a Dalit, and that's just an identity to a caste sensitive person that should not mean anything, but the outing was done very clearly in a particular manner, in a particular context, so that what the meaning was, he's a Dalit and we should discriminate him. And all that articulation is loaded with a simple outing. So here, outing as caste articulation is, which is why I think we have to be more aware of what sort of articulation is being made around us. If you look at the AKAC's caste testimonies, some of the testimonies are very subtle if you look at it. And one might even argue, well, this does not mean anything. Come on, this can be a normal conversation. No, it's not. Those are the dormant viruses, caste viruses. So that's where the caste actually lives. Those are the places where caste lives on a daily basis. And now that we are, given the context of this particular, what's happening in Silicon Valley and all that, I'd like to draw some attention that how the India's digital or IT success itself has a very strong caste color. And that's and again, that's another articulation as caste practice. As early as in 2004, the Prospect magazine, which is considered to be a somewhat liberal magazine from the UK, attributed that the Indian genius of IT success to the pedagogic and intellectual traditions rooted in Sanskrit Vedas. So it's this idea of reproducing Vedas without any flaws, without any mistake, has actually contributed them to write codes without any flaws. That's their argument. That's what they wrote. And more recently, even Amartya Sen, he made a reference when he made a speech at the Trade Association of Indian Information Technology. And Sen explained that IT success, India's IT success through its historical respect for distinctive skills and seeing it as a social contribution. So the distinctive skills, he referred to caste. The caste has many flaws, but it also offered a distinctive skills for specialization. That's what he said. So these are the kind of articulation that everyday, almost harmless reinforcing utterances, but these are the places where caste actually live. And then when they are dormant, when they are ruptured, then the articulation takes from benign to violent form. So it's not that we have to look at the violent form. It is. I think we have to look at the source, which is actually dormant everyday practice. I would like to also draw your attention to the point, to another point that it is becoming increasingly clearer that digital economy and IT sector are reproducing and social caste-based social hierarchies in different ways. And we have lots of examples. People in India, we see when people order food via Swiggy and they found out the person is actually not fit to deliver and that food is rejected. So we have to be very aware that how these practices actually remanifest and recodify in everyday life. And I think especially for people living overseas, this is becoming a very powerful tool for them to organize themselves without uttering the word caste. And that's, if you look at one example is that how Modi has organized himself, the rallies and so on. If you look at it, it has very strong, powerful, multicultural branding. It's being branded as recognizing Hindu culture as part of multicultural culture in the West. But multiculturalism, as we know, is often deployed as a deterrent tactic to prevent anti-caste campaign. One of the things that I always notice in London, whenever there is a Asian festival or multicultural Asian festival, the Indian side of it, it's always represented by Brahminical codes and markers. It's never represented by, not even Pakistani might be represented by Islam and so on, but the Indian culture, the multicultural space for Indians in the UK is dominated by dominant caste groups and dominant caste markers. And I know for a fact that in the UK, Valmiki's, the Buddhist practicing Dalits, they do not have sort of a strong space within when they discuss interfaith related conversation. Interfaith related conversation space is again dominated by dominant caste Hindus. So multiculturalism, again, it's a very interesting space, and it's actually it's not a favorable space for Dalits, especially in the Western in the Western societies. And we know that amongst diaspora that Hindu religion is often synonymous with Indian pride these days. And there is another layer of articulation happening now. This is particularly more visible in the West, especially after Modi's Hindutva, and how he is actually organizing Indian communities outside India. And a Hindutva project is a project by dominant caste groups and preservation of their caste identities. End of. And the India project outside India, any Indian association, multicultural association, as we know, that dominated by dominant caste groups, and Hindutva movement has always required both an aggressive and violent support base, which is actually small in numbers in many ways, but as well as sympathetic, ordinary citizens to win the populist support and keep the virus dormant and everyday practice. Amartya Sen referred to these groups as the lesser proto-Hindutva believers. So you need hardcore Hindutva advocates and ideologically sympathetic soft Hindus who help fuel and realize the dreams of the Hindutva project. And if you look at the conversation, some of the testimonies that the AKC has already published, you can see that how these are, they appear to be soft Hindutva, progressive Hindutva. These are all camouflaging markers. This mean nothing. There's only one. If you're a Hindutva, then you're actually for a pro-caste project. Simple as that. It's a casteist project. So in other words, what connects these proto-Hindutva believers, especially in this particular context, how this dominant caste group people come together, how they identify each other, and it's on the basis of Hindu pride, supremacy, caste identity. That's the core of it. It may appear to be very innocent on the surface, but at the core, it is about reinforcing each other's supremacist behavior. I also would like to actually point out, when we pay attention to practice, it enables us to critically engage with casteism in a much more nuanced manner, beyond apparent signifiers such as diversity, representation, and so on. Because diversity and representation may still work, may still be in operation, yet caste discrimination may continue to happen. That is what we've been witnessing despite reservation, so-called reservation policy. And I can tell you that from my own experience, my sector, media and communication sector, 2 examples, how practice may actually help us rethink discrimination in the present world. The first example is there is a magazine coming from Tamil Nadu called Dalit Murasu. And Dalit Murasu, it's been struggling, and it's a magazine dedicated to anti-caste movement, and it's rooted in annihilation of caste. Ambedkar magazine. When Dalit Murasu, when I interviewed Dalit Murasu's editor Punitha Pandiyan, he said, Dalit Murasu, as such as a media corporation, it's fully committed to anti-caste. So in a sense, if you look at the diversity and representation issue, it's completely ticked more than 100%, more than 100%. However, he said, but I cannot force a retailer to display my magazine in a shop. So retailers do not want our magazines to be put on display, because if you put the Dalit magazine on display, Punitha Pandiyan said, customers don't come in. So that's the practice-oriented discrimination, which is far more powerful. You don't need a violent trope to kill an institution. You simply boycott, and that's the power of practice. And the other thing is that again we are talking, especially in the context of Silicon Valley and Bay Area. I'd like to draw your attention to some of the emerging things that are happening that we should be very watchful of when it comes to caste practices in digital cultures. I have noticed time and again, even in so-called progressive online magazines, when an article written on Ambedkar or written about Dalits, written against dominant caste discrimination, I tend to pay attention to how the hyperlink and tags are created. And Ambedkar's article is always filed as Dalit story. Never a hashtag of legal philosophy, never a hashtag of economy and constitutional expert, none. So this is what I mean by practice. So an online magazine might have a very a sensitive, cost-sensitive, dominant cost journalist might write something, but the structure itself is not that attuned to the sensitivity. But the structure reproduces this. So in a sense, while appearing to be progressive, the system continues to reproduce these hierarchies. So what happens is that as a result, 5 years down the line, if anyone wants to search about Ambedkar's work, all they have to do is that they're forced to go back to use his caste identity, not his knowledge, not his intellectual caliber. So digital archive, digital storage is like, again, it's constituted by a certain point of practice. So we are not just looking at the front end diversity and representation sort of issues. That's my point. In other words, practice alerts us to much more nuanced ideas of caste practices and around us. And it actually enables us to, claim and make assertion what we otherwise think is not a big matter. Because that is why I think my final point is that, caste practices have become subtler than ever before. And this is why, while practices are subtle, we are also noticing caste positivism, which I'm not going to go into detail now, hoarding opportunities and so on. But my submission is that we have to be much more alert to these practice-oriented experiences and much more aware of these sort of everyday experiences and practices. And we should not hesitate to document it, however small it may appear to be, unquote unquote. But these are, as I called it, sources where caste viruses are living, and just because they are dormant, that doesn't mean they're harmless. And to that extent, and thank you, everyone. And I also would recommend if anyone has more testimonies, I think that's essential and critical for the campaign to, move to the next level. Thank you.